Welcome to the webinar, Delivering More Powerful Presentations by Enhancing 3 Communications Tactics. I want to start by just saying that I recognize that the people that are probably on this call are ones that are already probably speaking publicly, or those that would like to speak more publicly. And so I'm going to go through some tactics here that are pretty common sense. There are things that you go, yeah, I know that. Of course I know that. The key is, are you doing it well? And that is really what this presentation is about. So what do we need to know about creating presentations? Well, one of the things is that if you actually want to make a difference, whether you're in a nonprofit, whether you're a financial advisor, whether you're speaking in front of a large group or you're speaking in front of a couple of people, in order to get things done, in order to make change, in order to get somebody to say yes, we have to be able to speak. We have to be able to speak in a way that is super compelling. And most people are wordy. They use more words than necessary to get across what they need to get across. So what I want to talk about is one of the things that got me to speaking. So how did I become an expert on speaking? Well, I don't know that I'm an expert on the skill of public speaking, but I do speak publicly every single week, and I have for years. And so it doesn't necessarily make me an expert, but it makes me experienced. And I know what has worked and what hasn't worked. I know what has absolutely failed. And I know actually the structure of putting together a presentation that receives better response, better results, better outcomes than doing it another way. And so I'm simply going to share what I know. Now, it is true that today I speak a lot, and I speak a lot publicly, but that doesn't mean that I always knew what I was doing and could always be doing this. And so I want to share with you a few things that I've learned along the way, because when I started off speaking, I was definitely afraid of speaking. I did not like to be in front of groups. I was afraid of what could have happened, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But the very first time I spoke, I probably did a 3-hour presentation in about 40 minutes and just crammed it in and did all of this content in a very short period of time. And there were some things that I learned right away in that very first presentation. Number one, I was so nervous I couldn't eat for about a week that I needed to change that. That wasn't going to work if I wanted to ever speak again. I had to stay alive. But the other thing was, what I learned was, even though I had crammed in a ton of content, I still got some results. And so could I get even better results? And I started seeing a coach almost immediately when I started speaking, because I knew that I needed some additional help. And so I'm going to share with you what I know. One of the things that I have found out is, look, why do we want to speak? Well, what we need are more fans, more advocates, more people that feel differently about what we're talking about the subject matter, about us, about whatever it is, but you're standing up there speaking for a reason. And what we want is the audience to be our fan, not to be the opposite, not to be scrutinizing and wondering why you're saying these things and what do you know about this and those kinds of things. And so when we start off speaking, I think the goal should be, well, we want to get more fans. And one of the things that I always talk about in my presentation, and I talk about this for a very specific reason, is there's this concept of being a fan. And what is that concept? And the concept is simply this. If you think about, if you're a sports fan of a particular team, or a sports fan, or maybe not even a sports fan, maybe a fan of a product or a restaurant or a service, and if you're a real fan, then you have to ask yourself the question, why? Because fans do things differently. Fans give breaks. Like my team, actually, here is the team right here. My team has been losing quite a bit. Do we decide that we're not going to be a Packers fan because they're losing? No, because when you're a fan, there's something that goes on way deeper. And I'm not going to quit being a Packers fan and jump over to becoming a Bears fan just because they've been losing. We give fans a lot of breaks. When we're a fan of something, as fans, we give a lot of breaks to that product, that service, that company, and we do it for a very long time. The other thing about being a fan is that we always have a story. A fan always has a story. And what we want is our clients, our prospects, those people in the audience to also have a story about what they heard, about what they felt. When you hear a good presentation, we think of this a lot when we're thinking of motivational speakers, which I am not a motivational speaker, but motivational speakers come and you feel, if they've done their job, you feel differently about yourself or about other things when you leave that presentation. But there's no reason that even content-heavy speakers can't have their audience leave the presentation feeling something quite a bit differently. So I'm a Packers fan because of this woman. She's my grandmother. And I will almost always have this as part of a presentation that I deliver, a story about my grandmother. Why? Because I know that there are lots of things going on in the minds of the audience. And one of the things that I can do by kind of bringing it together and getting them to think internally, not to think about me, but everybody has a grandma. And everyone thinks differently about their particular life situation, and lots of people have close relationships with family members, and it sort of gets the audience thinking about themselves. And so I will always tell a story about my grandmother and how that ties into why I'm a Packers fan, because she was a Packers fan. I was her firstborn granddaughter, so I got to spend a lot of time with her. I got to do everything with her. And so that caused me to be a Packers fan. And the story that I tell about my grandmother goes about 2 minutes or a little bit less. And that story will be oftentimes what someone remembers about the presentation more than some of the other things that I think that they actually should remember. But the key is a story can tie in that memory of that presentation and the things that they have to do. What are they going to grab onto in your presentation? Now, not every presentation is going to have a personal story about your grandmother, but my presentations often do. And the reason for that is because we want to change, like I said before, we want to change the way people feel about us, about the topic, about doing something. And so as we think about constructing our presentation, we have to think, okay, how do we do this in a way that makes people change their minds or decide to do something? Now, that doesn't happen very often. And by the way, we have an attention span problem in the United States that's very pervasive, where no one's really paying attention to anybody. And if we want people to actually pay attention, we've got to be more compelling than we were. So were you born a professional speaker? Was anybody really born a professional speaker? And I would say no. And I'm going to prove that out, I think, in this presentation, because what it takes to speak, what it takes to speak in front of lots of people, to communicate effectively. Sometimes people have more embedded skills, but it is an art and science, actually. So some of you might be thinking, I hear this question a lot, well, there's this fear of speaking. And I mentioned before how scared I was of speaking when I first started speaking. And the reality is that it actually is something that is pretty intense in terms of making people not actually take on a new role or take a position or do something because they're actually afraid of speaking. And I'm going to see if I can play a video here by Jerry Seinfeld. Let's see if I can do it. He describes this pretty effectively. Here we go.
I saw a study that said speaking in front of a crowd is considered the #1 fear of the average person. I found that amazing. Number 2 was death. Death is number 2? This means to the average person, if you have to be at a funeral, you would rather be in the casket than doing the eulogy.
Going to try this again. Hold on 1 second. Technology is not all it's cracked up to be sometimes.
I saw a study that said speaking in front of a crowd is considered the #1 fear of the average person. I found that amazing. Number 2 was death. Death is number 2? This means to the average person, if you have to be at a funeral, you would rather be in the casket than doing the eulogy.
So basically what that's saying is, man, we have a lot of fears about speaking. And actually, it's not necessarily something about positioning how we feel about the actual delivery of the presentation. Yes, we're nervous, but I believe that if you're delivering something worthwhile, you're going to be nervous. I am nervous before I speak at every presentation. And it's not because I'm not prepared or I'm not sure what's going to happen. I'm actually excited. It's nervous energy that I need to be able to channel into delivering a really good presentation. If I'm not nervous at all, I'm probably thinking it's not a worthwhile presentation, or I don't care about the audience, which I always care about the audience very much. And if you think about it, it's actually not about you, it's about them. And so we think when we're presenting that it's all about us. That I'm up here, I'm presenting, how do I look, how do I sound? But really, it's all about how is it being transmitted to the audience? Are they being able to make change? And so when we turn it to the audience, it becomes a little less, I guess, hectic, if we can think of it that way. And the other thing is, what's the worst thing that can happen? Now, I've had all sorts of terrible things happen to me when I'm speaking, but none of them have ever caused me to never want to speak again. I have lost a heel on stage. I have almost fallen on stage. I did not. I've had electricity go out. I've had someone else's presentation piped into my room. Let's see. I've had all sorts of things. I've had a medical emergency in the audience. I've had people ask me questions that I don't know the answer to. I've had just about everything happen. Well, not everything, because I'm sure there's lots of other things that could possibly happen to me. But as I think about it, did I make it through those things? Yeah, I made it through all of it. It wasn't, the worst that can happen is actually not that bad if we know how to deal with it. So I'm going to go through 3 presentation Ds, if you will. And when I'm talking about these 3 Ds of presentation communications, again, I'm talking about things that are very common sense, but it also means that it's kind of simple to follow. That if you put together the right kind of presentation, you deliver the right kind of presentation, and you have the right idea in mind, that anyone can do a great presentation. So the first D in presentation design is thinking about, and let's go, thinking about something worth paying attention to. We have to actually design something worth paying attention to. And a lot of times we go, I just have these things that I'm going to talk about. But the best way to structure a presentation is to think about 3 things. There's got to be a challenge in every presentation. There's got to be a solution. And there must be a call to action. Challenge, solution, call to action. And if you think about a presentation that you're going to deliver, or one that you have delivered, or one that you've heard, every presentation must have a challenge, solution, and call to action if it is truly a good presentation. And so as you're thinking about the challenge, you think, well, what's the purpose of this presentation? And that's the challenge. So for instance, when I'm speaking in front of financial advisors, the first question that I will ask is, what's the most difficult thing that we have to do in this business? And everyone kind of looks at me and I say something like, it's not compliance. And then I maybe get a couple of quick laughs. And then I go, it's bringing on new clients. And I'm setting the stage for them agreeing with that is one of the most difficult things in this business. And so that's the challenge. And you kind of align everyone to your presentation. And then as a part of the presentation, you need to have a solution. What are you going to propose? So if bringing on new business is difficult, what are some strategies that will actually help? And how are you talking about these strategies in a way that makes it really real and implementable? And finally, there's a call to action. What do you want people to do about this? What do you want them to know about this? What do you want them to feel about this? And if we set these 3 things up, we have the makings for a strong design of a presentation. Now, this is not necessarily the outline of a presentation. It is the design of a presentation. Now, if we were doing this in a workshop format, I would ask you to pick a topic, any topic, write out the challenge, solution, and call to action. And I would actually ask you to do that before the next presentation that you do. What is the challenge of this presentation? What's the solution? And what's my call to action? And that will put you in a position to design a good presentation. If you do not have a challenge, if you do not have a solution, And if you don't have some kind of call to action, it's really not going to be. And this is proven by all sorts of people that train on speaking all the time, that these are the three things that must be in a good and compelling presentation. So the second thing we have to think about is describe. So as we're describing what we want to talk about, we have to think about, well, what is the model? What is the formula for describing what we want to talk about? Now, we want to have clarity and we want to have persuasion. But how do we do that? And as we're thinking about clarity and persuasion, this is really the outline of describing this presentation. We have an introduction where we typically set up the challenge. We've got 3 to 4 main points in every good presentation, and we've got a conclusion. So the 3 to 4 main points are kind of the main points in this presentation. We've got 3 Ds in this presentation. When I speak, I often have 4 absolutes. It's either 3 or it's 4. Why? Because we can kind of get our arms around that. If we start doing 10 points to the presentation and you tell people there's 10 points to the presentation, they might kind of check out in advance going, oh boy, this is going to be long. People want to know that they're going to get something good out of this introduction, 3 to 4 main points, conclusion. So let's talk about the introduction. Now, the introduction really should be something that's attention-getting. And it doesn't need to be that you say something wild and crazy. It just needs to be that you get people centered on what you're talking about. It's like when I ask the question, what's the most difficult thing we have to do in this business? It's bringing on new clients. That actually translates into, okay, well, what does she know about that? But fine, I've got everyone listening because it is a big challenge. And if I've actually got some solutions on that, it might be worthwhile to listen in. Now, if I start some other way that doesn't really center them and center them quickly, I could lose them from the very beginning. Now, the 3 to 4 main points, oftentimes in 3 to 4 main points, there are stories, analogies, points that you're making in your 3 to 4 main areas. And the stories and the analogies actually will prove your point. So if you say, well, this is a good strategy for bringing on new business. That's great, but tell me who's done it and what it looks like and how did it happen for them? And once you share that, you've now proven your point. It's not just an idea or a theory. It's something that someone has actually done. Let me show it to you. Let me allow you to see this. How did they do it? How much did it cost them? How long did it take? What kind of results did they get? Now we've got something that actually works. Now, when I do a presentation, I will often talk about my own business card. Now, how does that have to do anything with the audience? Well, I don't start with this. At some point in the presentation, I will pull up my business card because it's a way of sharing your story. And it's an example for those that are marketing themselves or marketing their own personal brands. This is my example of that. And I tell some stories around it and I poke fun at myself when I do this. But I actually want people to know this Red Zone marketing story. And so I'll tell the story with my business card. I'll tie it back to my grandmother and I will make a joke about my weight, which is not real on my card. It is a fake weight. And fake weights are never higher than they should. They're always lower than they should be. So that's kind of the theory behind this. And I tell some stories about it and that's that. But I want people to tie in, especially as I'm a marketing person talking about being memorable. I've got to actually show how I could be memorable and how you could be memorable. And so I tie this in, which is part of my story. So you can tie also your own personal things in as you're making your points. And finally, in the presentation design, there's a conclusion. Now, a conclusion should summarize what you talked about. It should make a powerful statement and have some kind of call to action. So in some presentations, you may not be selling anything. I'm not selling anything in this presentation today. That doesn't mean that there's not a call to action. Because for me, the call to action in this presentation, as you will see as we go through, is that I would like to see people do better presentations. I would like to see financial advisors and entrepreneurs and people do better presentations than they are doing perhaps now. And it's not for me to judge whether your presentation is good or not, only you know that. But if you're on this call, you're probably thinking, well, maybe I could get a little bit better. And so my call to action is, here are some things that you could do to absolutely bring a smarter presentation to the stage, whether it's a small stage or it's a large stage. So again, we've got the introduction, 2 main points, and the conclusion. And if we were in a workshop format of this presentation, I would ask you to kind of start laying that out just in an outline based on the presentation that we talked about before, topic that you pick. Well, what could I actually talk about? What would be my introduction? How would I open it up? What would be maybe 3 or 4 main points, and how would I close it? And this is kind of how we build presentations. Now, I go see my speaking coach, and this is what we do. This is what we go through. Here's the introduction, here's the conclusion, and here is the body of the presentation, and we build it out together. Now, I do it with a speaking coach because I actually get paid to speak, and when I get paid to speak, I want to make sure that I'm doing the absolute best job possible. And in order to do that, I hire a coach to make sure that I've got the best presentations put together that have been totally thought through and that have been practiced a lot. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. So the third thing in a great presentation is to deliver the message. Now, this is the part that sometimes we forget about, because we go, okay, I'm working on the words, and I'm going to get this design down, and I've got my challenge and solution and call to action. I'm going to get introduction and 3 to 4 main points and a conclusion. And then you go in front of the audience and you deliver this fantastic presentation. And we really have to deliver something that's worth listening to. And the problem with that actually is that sometimes what you say is actually not nearly as important as how you say it. And I know that that's, we don't like to actually think that when we work so hard on putting together the most perfect presentation, but actually there's been a lot of statistics and things that have been proven, and you've probably heard this before, about how important the nonverbal is. And MIT actually did a study on this. They did several rounds of studies on this. But MIT invited business professionals in to be a part of a business plan competition. And in the business plan competition, they were to present this business plan idea, and there were some judges, and they were going to judge and be able to pick the winner of the business plan competition. However, the night before the business plan competition, they held a cocktail party. And at the cocktail party, they actually looked at other aspects, not what people were saying, but how they were talking to one another, how closely they were standing, how loudly they were talking. They actually put together, they had people wear a Sociometer, which is kind of a wearable that measures some of the nonverbal aspects. Are you nervous? What are you mimicking the other person? Are you trying to develop a connection? Are you looking over someone's shoulder and deciding that you do not want to talk to them anymore? The researchers were observing this at the cocktail party. And from that cocktail party, they actually could pick out whom they thought was going to win the business plan competition the next day. So simply from observing at the cocktail party, they felt that they could select the winner of the business plan competition. And you say that's impossible. There's absolutely no way that we should be able to pick out somebody from observing them and not even listening to the words they were saying at a cocktail party. What about the business plan? What about all the elements of the business plan? And actually, it's interesting because with 83% certainty, they could, because they did this over and over and over again, they could actually pick out who would be the winner of the business plan competition the next day by simply looking at how they were interacting with one another at the cocktail party. So the researchers, the first night, had 83% similarities with the researchers at the business plan competition. And you say, well, how could somebody possibly do that if they don't even know what they're saying? I mean, we work so hard on the content of our business and we present this great presentation, but it's actually the presentation style that matters so much. And it's what we don't always think about, because that's kind of the last thing, right? I'm going to build my presentation. I'm going to work on this great presentation, and then I'm going to go deliver it. Well, more research says that, and this is really, really depressing, especially for a writer like myself. I've written 7 books. I write all the time. I write for clients. We do scripting and messaging and sales scripting and all sorts of things. And 7% of what is said influences an audience. 93% of audience influence comes from the nonverbal and the vocal. And by the way, the vocal, what that means is it's, again, not the words, but if you think of whether you like her or you don't like her, Hillary Clinton has a bit of a shrill voice. And sometimes when you hear that shrill voice, it doesn't matter what they're saying, you just can't get it in your mind. And I think you've probably heard people like that before, their voice was distracting. And the voice is distracting, the nonverbal could be distracting, the way someone is standing, what they're wearing, their hairstyle, their lipstick color, what shoes they're wearing. And for men, it could be all sorts of other things. I mean, if you think about what's really important, I believe very strongly that it is the messaging that is really important. These other aspects could be distractions, and we do not want them to be distractions. So how do we take that off the table as a distraction? Well, we've got to think about the nonverbal, the body language, what we wear. And I have men that will often say, what I'm going to say next is not true and it's not real. But I will tell you right now that as a woman who speaks, it matters what I wear. And it matters what I wear because I get comments on my evaluation forms. I get evaluation forms. I request them at every single presentation. I get evaluation forms asking me things like, oh, how many red suits do you have? Oh, I love your shoes. And all sorts of comments about my appearance. And it surprised me at first when I started to get these, because I really feel like a man could stand up with a crumpled suit on and kind of hair messed up and deliver a good presentation and standing ovation. And a woman comes up in that same position, crumpled suit, hair messed up. It doesn't have the same reaction from the audience. And so if you're a woman on this call, we just have to think about, I like to take away the distraction. I have my suits made so that they're not too tight, so that they do not accentuate anything. I just want them to be in the background. I don't want what I'm wearing to be at the foreground. I don't want my shoes to be at the foreground. I don't want any of that. I want people to be able to listen to what I'm saying. But in order to do that, I've got to think through all of these things. And body language is really important too. How tall you're standing. Are you standing straight? Are you slumped over? Do you look like you are in pain? You see some people, they just look like they're in pain by the way that they're standing. Stand up straight, shoulders back. And those kinds of things project other things like confidence and eye contact. I have a client who sometimes will close his eyes when he speaks. And that's very distracting if you're speaking to a large audience. He's thinking about what he's saying, and that's why he's closing his eyes. But that doesn't necessarily work if you're speaking in front of a large audience. So vocal elements, we talked about this, but it's really having and making sure that you've got the right tone and inflection in what you're saying. And how do you know whether you've got good tone and inflection? Well, the best way to find out is to record a presentation, and it could be a presentation that you're delivering or that you're just practicing. You could use your iPad and just record it, or just your phone or whatever it is. Record your presentation and listen. Now, nobody likes the sound. Well, some people probably like the sound of their voice. I do not like the sound of my voice, but that's the sound. It's the real sound that other people hear. So we have to be paying attention to what that inflection is. And the most important thing, and I think this is the reason that very first presentation I did, that very first presentation where I took hours and hours of content and put it into like 40 minutes of a presentation. And it was still received well enough that I had 40 financial advisors that wanted to work with my firm. I was not a great speaker, but there was one thing that I was really, 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 really good at. And that was being passionate about the topic I was speaking about. I was very passionate about this topic. And the topic was, I had helped a financial advisor become more successful by using some marketing strategies. He was a financial advisor. And I thought that the story was worth telling. I was passionate about what we had done and how we did it and how we spent so little money to generate so many assets for this particular advisor. I was passionate about it. And sometimes I think passion wins over some of the other mistakes that we might make in a presentation. And I have learned that from the very beginning. But probably the most important thing to do, and this is where we can tell all sorts of things, is this element of practice. Now, most of the people that I work with don't necessarily want to practice. You're pretty good at being in front of people. You can just wing it. You can go and do it. But if you think about how much better you could be if you didn't wing it, if you practiced and practiced and practiced. And oftentimes we just don't find the time to put in the practice, but I practice before I do every single presentation, every single presentation. If I've delivered the presentation 50 times, I am still practicing it, going it over in my mind, making sure that it's meeting with who that exact audience is going to be that day. I will always practice the presentation. So one of the things that I found is I'm doing a little bit of research on success. I mean, all of you know about Steph Curry and how successful he is as a basketball player. He was also quite overlooked for a very long time, as we all know. But here's something interesting about him. When he was younger, he went to a Kobe Bryant skills camp. And he was probably the least recognized player at this Kobe Bryant skills camp. And he just had a different mindset than the other people. And this story has been told by those that were at this camp. So they did a few practices every day, 30 minutes before every single practice. Steph would go out on the court and shoot. He would probably take 150 shots before anyone stepped foot on the court. All the other players came on much later. He's out there shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting. And then when the practice is over, he will stay out there. He will never leave the court until he's swished 5 free throws in a row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If he misses 4, he does it again until he gets 5 in a row. It's a habit of practice. And I think if we get in a habit of practicing things like presentations, it makes a really big difference. And I'll tell you another quick story about Jerry Seinfeld and his ability to practice. I was listening to an interview where he was talking about how he gets ready to do a comedy show. So let's say he's going to be on HBO or something like that. And it just seems like he's kind of leaning on a stool and telling a story that happened to him yesterday. And that's kind of his style, right? He makes people laugh because he's just talking about everyday stuff that happened to him yesterday. But then when he was talking in this interview, I discovered that that's not at all the way that he puts together a comedy show. He will actually think of jokes all day long, every day. It's kind of an incessant thing that he does. And he's collecting all of these jokes and collecting maybe hundreds of jokes. And then he starts practicing them and going through them and figuring out, well, what would be a good lineup of jokes that I could use in a presentation. And then when you think, okay, he must be ready to go to HBO. He's got all these jokes and all these things that he's going to talk about. But no, he actually goes to a small comedy club, shows up unannounced, and he works his jokes. He works his routine. And he sees what's funny, what is getting good response, what's not getting good response. And then he goes back and he works on it more. And then he doesn't go straight to HBO. He goes back to the comedy club, shows up unannounced, practices his jokes in front of a live audience and sees what's working and what's not working. He does that 3 times before he ever goes in front of a live paying audience. Why? Because it matters. And I think if we think about presentations that really matter, whether it's presenting in front of a board or whether it's presenting in front of a family, if it really, really matters, then we practice. And I think it's probably the least favorite thing about this entire presentation, because people say, oh, I don't want to practice. I don't want to video myself. I don't want to do role playing. I don't want to do that. But it is the way that we get better. And it was the hardest thing that I had ever done, was to go and see a speaking coach, because now I'm on the line in front of somebody. I'm presenting in front of him. I'm running my ideas in front of him. And then I'm going and I'm delivering a presentation and I'm getting back with him and I'm telling him how it went and I'm videoing myself and I'm figuring all of this stuff out. It's a constant process. I'll never be done practicing for presentations. If it matters, then you practice. And it's one of the things that's easy enough to do. You just have to build in the time. So what we've talked about today is designing a really great presentation by thinking about 3 elements. What's your challenge? What's the purpose of this presentation? What's the solution? What are you proposing that they do about it? And what's the call to action? What action do you want them to take as a result of listening to this presentation? Then the second D is describe. We've got an introduction to a presentation. We've got 3 to 4 main points and a conclusion. It's the outline of a good presentation. And this is very obvious that this would be an outline of a presentation, but it's the 3 to 4 points that's really critical. We have to have just a few points that we could make very strong to get across, even if it's a long presentation. Whether it's a 15-minute presentation or an hour-and-a-half presentation, you really should have 3 to 4 main points. Now, you might embellish a little bit. You might talk and share some more stories and as involved with the different points that you might deliver, but 3 to 4 points is the number that people can absorb and remember. And finally, deliver. We've got to think about all the things that could just distract somebody from listening to a really great presentation. And we don't want to provide the distractions because we work so hard figuring out how to design and describe this presentation. We want to make sure that it is really, really good. So again, if we want to actually get things done, make a powerful case, confidently lead others, make an impact, foster change, we've got to be able to speak very, very, very well. And in speaking very well, it doesn't mean that you're using the best diction and that you're using all of the proper words. It's that you're authentic and that you're practiced and that you've thought about who that audience is and you care about it and you're passionate and you are delivering a presentation that has a challenge and a solution and a call to action, because that is really what we need to do in order to get others to do what we would like them to do, whatever the cause and the purpose is that we're talking about. So as you think about this presentation, what I would like you to do is to think about how you might do your presentations differently. Laying out a presentation, thinking about it from a perspective of the audience, not necessarily thinking about it from the perspective of someone who's going to be up and talking in front of that audience. What do we want them to do? What do we want them to know? And most importantly, what do we want them to feel? So thank you very much for listening in on this presentation. If you want more information about Red Zone Marketing, you can go to redzonemarketing.com. Thank you very much.